Hello and welcome to Windows in Time, Scheme or Scam, Rogueland's attempts to make the Agate Desert bloom, presented by Jackson County Library Services. My name is Megan and I'm Adult Services Librarian here at the Medford branch. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and the Modoc Nation, as well as the Shasta, Takelma, and Lakawa people whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We take this moment to recognize the indigenous people whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services.
So at the beginning of the 1900s, there was tremendous growth in the fruit industry in the Rogue Valley. As a result, the orchard lands were more and more expensive. And by 1910, the boom was at its height, and available land for orchards were scarce and so at a premium. But there was one large tract of land left in the valley, the 7,000-acre Agate Desert. Many people thought that since it was a desert, if one could just get water to it, it would bloom with orchards. This is the story of bringing water to that desert and what happened after that. So let's talk about where we are here. Roguelands, which is the Agate Desert, were south or below the Rogue River and Little Butte Creek. They're east of or to the right of Bear Creek, north of Central Point, and west of about the Crater Lake Highway. You have that in your mind? The southern border is rather jagged, but it's north of Central Point. So as you see, there are pieces that come down further towards Central Point and then other parts that don't. Yeah. Okay, so that's the territory we're talking about. Now, the question was, could that land ever produce this kind of fruit, like was being produced everywhere else in the Rogue Valley? Well, this is the Rogueland's brochure, definitely assuring that all you needed to do was irrigate that desert and it would produce fruit like this. Not everybody agreed with that, but let's start with what history tells us. Actually, it's the geology that's really important here because that, well, first of all, the Agate Desert wasn't a desert. It got as much rainfall as the rest of the valley got. We didn't call the rest of the valley a desert, but it was called a desert because there weren't any trees growing on it. That's why people thought of it as a desert. So why weren't there any trees growing on it? Well, this is going to be the worst geology lesson you ever had. Eons ago, my time periods are very vague. So eons ago, there was a great lake bed that covered all of this area. And it was a very rich in organic material. And shells of things were deposited and deposited and deposited in this lake bed until there was a fairly thick layer of limestone that formed. Okay. Then the Klamath Mountains were raised up. That's the Siskiyous. And that brought that lake bed up. Then the Cascade Range is all volcanic, and that starts rising and covering this lower area with lava. So now you have limestone and lava basalt, which in this area was a very clay-rich basalt. And now you have thousands of years of water eroding all this away and depositing it in the gravels and so forth in the lowlands. And often these deposits that rivers made were rich soils that would build up a wonderful loam, but not here. Here, the Rogue River scoured the area. So what you ended up with were two things. The limestone and water and air often form calcium carbonate. And two things happen with calcium carbonate. One, when it filters through the cracks in the lava, in the holes in the lava, it forms agates. Agate desert. There are lots of agates found there till today, all over the place. Okay. The second thing that happens is when the basalt is pulverized by rivers, it forms something called a blue clay. And when you add calcium carbonate or lime and clay and water, do you know what you get? Concrete. The hard pan in the agate desert is not like the usual mineral hard pans that you find other places. It is essentially a form of concrete. Okay. And that goes a long way toward explaining what happens in this crazy area. Because in the wintertime, when it rains and there's a lot of water, it's essentially held by that hard pan, which is just like a concrete jug. And because it's kind of got rounded mounds in it, the water accumulates in the low spots and forms what are called vernal or temporary pools. Now these vernal pools are very lush in the spring, and they produce beautiful beds of wildflowers, just lovely. But then as soon as it starts to get hot, all that water dries up and you're just left with the hard clay. Okay. So when the first European settlers came, you can sort of see what you need to see here. They were settling on the good land, donation land claimers, free land, free government land for the taking, for the using. But looking at this 1859 statehood map, notice that the whole left hand, especially lower left hand side, is taken up with donation land claims. That's the Bear Creek Valley. Okay. And then across the top, again, lots of places. That's north or above the Rogue River. Okay. But look at the blank spot. That's the Agate Desert. So the early pioneers looked at that land and said, there are no trees growing on it. It can't be good for anything. Okay. So they didn't set up claims there. Now, it was good for a few things, and people did eventually take out some homesteads in that area because you could get most years a winter wheat crop that you harvested in the spring. You could get one crop of hay, and the grass did grow in abundance here. And you could raise cattle. You could feed them part of the year if you had someplace else to take them for the rest of the year. So it was possible to eke out a living. It was not a good living, but you could make it. So there were people that did eventually settle here. But As so often happened when the pioneers settled, the European pioneers settled here, they overlooked what the native peoples saw in land. And for the native peoples, I'm going to butcher this, Tatsipekwank was a Garden of Eden in the spring. Camas grew everywhere in the Agate Desert. And so people came from all around to harvest the camas roots in late spring, which was a staple food for them. Not only that, there were other kinds of plants, medicinal plants, that they learned to use that grew only there. So the native peoples knew the Agate Desert not as a desert, but as a rich source of food and medicine for them. The European pioneers missed that part of it. But people did settle there, and it became known, instead of the Agate Desert, it became known as the Big Sticky. Remember that blue clay that was on top of the hard pan when it rained? Oh my goodness. I hope you can see that these people are carrying big sticks that they would use to knock the mud off the wheels of their wagon so it wouldn't get too heavy for the horses. And there's a quote by Grace Simpson Skeeters, who described what her family had found when they went to Jacksonville. They stopped frequently. It apparently was possible to keep moving slowly as long as you knocked the mud off the wheels. But their family actually stopped frequently to knock the mud off the wheels because it would get so heavy the horses couldn't pull the wagon. Now that's sticky. Okay. I got to go back. Sorry. There were still people that had the idea that if you just could irrigate this in the summertime, think about the Big Sticky, you want that all year. If you could just irrigate in the summertime, you could get good crops. And there was a man named L.C. Coleman. He was a local man, but he apparently knew C.P. Huntington of the Southern Pacific Railroad. And in 1887, when the Southern Pacific Railroad was finished through, so you could go from Portland to San Francisco, he actually talked to Huntington and said, look at this land. You develop land around the railroads all the time. This would be a good thing for you to develop. And Huntington took him up on it and sent a representative to look over the land and to see if indeed they could develop it with some process. But apparently the representative listened to the beginners because there were people that were sure you couldn't raise anything. And this is a quote from one of the knockers. You can't raise a disturbance on that land no matter how much water you put on it. All you can get is frogs and skeeters. So you have opposing views. You have the people who say we just need to get water on it, we can raise anything, and you have the people that say you can't raise anything on that land except frogs and skeeters. Okay. Well, in 1891, Henry Clipple, who was a pioneer in the valley and involved in many things and owned what today is Tolo, he owned that land. He and a couple of partners established the Rogue River Valley Water Company. And they were long on ideas, but short on action. They did establish the company, and the idea was to build a ditch from Fish Lake to the Agate Desert to irrigate it. Now, Fish Lake was the only lake of any size on the west side of the Cascade Summit. There are lots of lakes on the east side, but only Fish Lake on the west side. So that's the one that would be easy to bring water, and it was located rather close to the Agate Desert. And the other advantage is that the outlet stream was Little Butte Creek, and Little Butte Creek could carry the water, and they wouldn't even have to build a ditch till they got fairly far down Little Butte Creek, and then they could build the ditch down to the Agate Desert. Well, that was the idea, but nothing came of it until 1898. And that's when the Fish Lake Ditch Company, which built the canals, and the Jackson County Improvement Company, which owned the land to be irrigated, were formed. One company, but the two different projects that were going on. And this was a group of California irrigation pioneers. They'd done some big projects in California, made a lot of money. So they had fairly good backing. And they hired a man named Viet McCary, who had been an engineer in many of those projects, and he was a good one. And so he came up and said, easy, I can get water down here, no problem. And they, within 4 years, they had engineered the entire project, obtained water rights from the state to Fish Lake water, built a road to the lake, surveyed and built 16 miles of canal to the desert from a point on Little Butte Creek, which was known as the Bradshaw Drop on the Bradshaw Ranch. They had also built a dam at Fish Lake to impound more water so that they would have a ready supply year round. And this is actually a picture of dams at 4 Mile Lake, but they built the same kind of dam at Fish Lake. So the idea is you put these logs, pilings, into the ground, and then behind you fill in with rock and rubble. And that was a fairly standard small dam construction style that was used for that and worked really well. Well, so they got water. By 1902, they had water running to the Agate Desert. And in California, when they built water projects, people flocked in and bought the land from them as soon as it was irrigated. That didn't happen here. Nobody bought any land from them. So they'd run this water down, but they didn't have any takers for the land. Until 1905, and then he wasn't a taker for the land. He already had his own land. Fred Hopkins had bought the Snowy Butte Orchard, which is just southwest of Central Point. There's a big subdivision called Snowy Butte Subdivision there today. It was a beautiful orchard, a high-producing orchard. He was one of the biggest money makers in the orchard boom. But he didn't like the fact that in dry years, he didn't get enough fruit to sell. So he said to the Fish Lake Ditch Company, how about you build your canal onto my place, and other people will sign up, I'm sure, and we'll be able to irrigate with Fish Lake water. So they'd already built a canal on the east side up as far as Delta Waters Road is today. So the Fish Lake Company agreed to keep going. They crossed Bear Creek at McAndrews Ford, McAndrews Ranch. Today it's McAndrews Road, and the canal still crosses the bridge at McAndrews. Okay. The Hopkins Canal is a very prominent part of irrigation in the valley today. So it crosses clear, that's That's south of the mall. And then it comes north to hit Hopkins Ranch. And eventually it came along the old stage road clear out to West Scenic. But that's a little later in the story. So with the Hopkins Canal, then Hopkins built all kinds of laterals off the canal to irrigate his orchards. And it was very successful. And other people saw how good it was that we had land along the ditch, along the Hopkins Canal, and said, oh, yes, let's sign up too. And the sign up was pretty reasonable. $50 would get you the water rights in perpetuity, and it only cost $2.50 an acre yearly. That was pretty reasonable water. So a lot of people signed up. Well, now the Fish Lake Ditch Company has to think about how much water they've got. They knew they had enough water to irrigate the Agate Desert, and they had all the canals there. It was ready to go if anybody ever bought the land. Now they're adding all these people that are using water on the Hopkins Canal. Are they going to have enough water? To get enough water, there are several things that would have to happen. You'd have to build a bigger dam to impound more water, but Fish Lake had a limited amount of water, so you'd also have to find another source, which they found in 4 Mile Lake. 4 Mile Lake is on the east side of the Cascade Divide, but it's higher than Fish Lake. And by building a canal from 4 Mile Lake around a mountain to a pass in the Cascades, they could drop it into a natural ditch, a natural stream bed that would take it onto Fish Lake. So, okay, they know where they can get the water. It's an easy engineering project. Oh, but it costs money. You have to build a dam there. You have to build all that canal. So they were pausing. They didn't build it, but they knew it could be built. Well, then the city of Medford comes along. Now, Medford city water is coming from Bear Creek, and it is increasingly polluted by all the farming that goes on above it. So they've been hunting around for a new source of water. They tried all kinds of possibilities and finally decided that the Fish Lake Ditch Company was going to be the cheapest, easiest way to get water to the city of Medford. So they contracted in 1908 with the Fish Lake Ditch Company to put this pipeline in with wooden pipes and pipe it to a brand new reservoir they were building on Capitol Hill, east Medford, and it's still there today. It's been fixed up. And by 1909, they are piping water from this Fish Lake system for the city of Medford. Well, now the Fish Lake Ditch Company is in real trouble. They definitely do not have enough water to satisfy the city of Medford, the Hopkins Canal users, and the Agate Desert. So they either have to pony up a whole lot of money to build the system bigger, which they know how to do, or sell it. And the decision was to sell it. Now, we get to Roguelands. Doesn't that sound better than the Jackson County Improvement Company lands? Yes, well, Patrick Welch was a Spokane entrepreneur. He had contracts to build much of the railroads in the Northwest. He had copper mines, he had gold mines, and more money than he knew what to do with. And he got interested in this Jackson, in the Fish Lake irrigation project. So he took an option to buy the place in 1909 and sent his engineers down, who did in 6 months did $150,000 worth of surveying That's equivalent to $5 million today in just surveying what they might do to make all this system work. And he decided it would, so he bought it in 1910 outright for $400,000 at the time, which was about $45 million. Fish Lake Ditch Company people did very well. It's the height of the orchard land boom. Prices are higher than any time in history. So they did very well. Now, Roguelands, I don't know whether you remember that first map of Roguelands, but it took in what on this map is well to Bear Creek and the Rogue River to north of Central Point. Well, the Jackson County Improvement Company was only the land that's in pink. And Roguelands was a lot more than that. And the land in orange belonged to Sophia Gore. Now, there is an interesting woman, as was her stepmother, who was also her aunt, Sally Ish, who became the largest landowner in Jackson County before 1900. But that's a story for another day. And I have not had a chance to see how it is that Sophia Gore ended up with all the rest of Rogueland's lands. There's got to be another story there, how but who else made big money in 1910 when they sold to Patrick Welch is Sophia Gore, because that's the other half of what became Roguelands. So, another story for another day. Welch hit the ground running. They did so much in the first year. It was quite amazing. Let's see. First of all, he hired F.N. Cummings, who was a local engineer who'd done a lot of work in Josephine County irrigation, and who seemed to be the same kind of visionary that Welch was. So they bought the company, all rights to the properties, and had this vision. Could you take it's now called Roguelands. It was the Jackson County Improvement and Sophia Gore's land. Could you take the Roguelands that looked like this and turn them into orchard lands like the rest of the valley had that looked like this? And he was sure he could. So they subdivided Roguelands into plots of 5, 10, and 40-acre lots. Notice that the Pacific and Eastern Railroad runs right through the middle. A big selling point, because you don't have to haul your fruit all the way to the Southern Pacific Railroad to put it on, to have it shipped around the country. You've got a railroad right there in the middle of Roguelands. He plotted out a small town site. He built a school that was not only an elementary school, but a high school. There were lots of little one-room schools around Jackson County. There were some around Roguelands, but a high school, people had to go to Jacksonville or Medford or Central Point to go to a high school. So there was a superintendent, the county superintendent of schools visited this school and said, the building is fine, but there's no shade and no playground equipment. So he must have visited about the time this picture was taken. It's not a very hospitable schoolyard. They also built a home orchard, a home farm, and they planted everything there. It was right on the railroad. It had its own flag stop, and they planted orchards and vineyards and strawberry patches and corn and melons. Everything that you could imagine raising, they raised at the home place as a model farm so that people could see what it was that they could turn their plot into. All it took was irrigation and a little more. That hard pan continued to cause problems. So they bought, Welch sent down 2 brand new steam tractors that were immense. And they tried plowing the land. Didn't work. So they put 3-foot steel bars on behind these tractors and dragged them through the hard pan to break it up. Modestly successful. Not really. Okay. But they were working at getting that land plantable. They adopted a system of planting crops between the trees so that as the young trees would grow, they would still have some income so that they could advertise to people. You buy a place and you plant these crops in between the trees and you get a certain amount of money every year until the trees grow up, and then you get a lot of money. Okay? So that was the idea. And they planted all kinds of things, corn and melons and things like that in the row crops. I don't know whether any of you are familiar with orchards, but these trees are set pretty far apart because they get really big, technically, except in the Roguelands. Now, the real genius of Roguelands was advertising. They promoted this land like you wouldn't believe. This little booklet that I call the pear booklet, it's just a small thing that you could put in an envelope and mail to somebody. But it's a booklet that has pictures of the pears in the Rogue Valley. They really used the fact that Rogue Valley was producing some of the best fruit in the world, that it was shipped to England as well as New York and Chicago, that it was fabulous, apples and pears both. It was great. So the pictures in the brochure are from the valley, and the statistics are from the valley, not from Roguelands. Cummings was managing this whole project, and I think he was probably behind some of this advertising campaign. But here's what you could do at the bottom with a 10-acre plot. You take an acre for your house, another acre for alfalfa to feed your stock. Everybody had to have a cow and pigs, something. You put an acre in strawberries. That's the crop that'll keep you going until the trees are mature. An acre in other berries and garden truck, raise all kinds of vegetables. And then 6 acres in orchard. You're independent. You can live on there, technically. They invited local folks to come. Remember, they're on the Pacific and Eastern Railroad, so they hired a special train to bring people from Medford out to spend a morning at their home place where they're going to show you how they plant trees. I don't know whether you can read the fine print, but they plant trees with dynamite. You drill a hole 3 feet deep, you pack it full of dynamite, and you set it off, and it explodes and blasts the hard pan to bits. But remember, it's a kind of concrete. And now you have a hole in which you can plant the tree. That's how they planted them. And it was successful for a while. A young tree would grow quite nicely. But as it started to get larger, think about what's happening. It's essentially in a cement bowl. So there's no place for its roots to grow as it gets bigger. And worse than that, in the winter when it rains, the water sits on the roots. Well, when the trees started to get older, they just failed. They did not thrive. They failed. But it was a great scheme. It must have been a fabulous show to go out and watch them blasting holes to put trees in. Okay. Now, by the way, that technique is not unique to them. There are orchards in other places that had hard pan that used that technique quite successfully, but their hard pan had soil underneath it. So in 1910, now remember, he just buys the place in early 1910. He starts this advertising blitz, and there are all kinds of things showing pictures of what already exists in the orchard industry here in the valley, not from their orchards. But advertising the irrigated tracts are the way to go. They took pictures of their own orchards, which now are flourishing for a short time longer, showing the water in abundance there for them. And they used those pictures in advertising. In 1911, they advertised in Sunset Magazine, that's the green rimmed one, and in Better Fruit Magazine, which is the one where the picture is. They were advertising all the time. They advertise all over the country. This is an ad from the Oxford, Ohio Monitor, from their paper. And this one describes how you make money. You only have to pay $350 down and $350 a year for 4 more years. So for $1,750, you can get 5 acres of planted orchard. Okay. And they talk about how much money you can make, which is about the maximum of any orchard in the valley. It was very hopeful. Now, not everybody believed in this scheme. Remember, there were those early knockers. Well, there still were knockers. And apparently they've been advertising in Kansas because this circular was found in Kansas. It was done by the Central Labor Council of Medford. And what they have to say is not very good. They say that the place is overrun with people who are unemployed, who came out for the advertising of these beautiful, wonderful places. The only land that's left to buy is in this desert where they have to blast holes for the fruit trees. And it's expensive. This is the height now of the orchard land boom. Land is as expensive as it's going to get. Well, so there were people who were not happy with this. And in 1912, I'm going to go back. In 1912, the fruit land, the orchard land boom went bust. They'd maxed out the reasonable orchard lands. The prices were way too high. Some people had made fortunes, like Sophia Gore and Hopkins, who sold out in 1910, made a fortune. A lot of the longtime orchardists sold out in 1910 at astronomical prices. They made fortunes. Some of them got back in the business after the prices went way down. Well, 1912 is the last year we have any advertising for Roguelands. Apparently, they just had to give it up. Now, Wells liked this country. He thought it was really lovely, and he had this home place, and he had a whole lot of land, about 6,800 acres of land that hadn't sold. So he turned it into a big cattle ranch, and he would come for a month every year to enjoy his Roguelands ranch at that time, until he died in 1929. He came every year. But there was no more trying to sell irrigated orchard plots. None of that. That was gone. And by 1925, which was the height of the amount of acres that were in orchards in the valley, this map maps out all the orchards in the whole valley. Maximum acreage. Looking at Roguelands, which is in gray, you see any orchards? There's not an orchard left. Not even the home place has an orchard left. It's a cattle ranch, and it's gone. Now, Roguelands was only one part of the business. Remember, they bought that whole irrigation system from the lakes and the canals and Hopkins Canal, which was a big going concern. Well, Welch hadn't stopped during the time that he was doing Rogueland's promotion. And the Rogue River Valley Ditch Company, which sometimes they called the Rogue River Valley Canal Company because it sounded better, he put a lot of money into this system. In 1910, he bought these 3 big Franklin automobiles just to transport his surveyors around, who were engineering these projects to come. 3 of them he bought all at once. He built a canal to Medford that went all the way to Phoenix, but it irrigated that whole east side of Medford, all the way to Phoenix. Okay. Big orchards in there, so they were irrigating that. This is kind of what the whole system looks like at the mid-teens. So 4 Mile Lake, he finished the dam there and finished the canal, the Cascade Canal. They brought it to the summit and then down a stream bed to Fish Lake. He rebuilt the dams at 4 Mile and Fish Lake to make them even bigger and more modern, and put in fish ladders, which people were complaining about not having fish ladders. Still went down the North Fork of Little Butte Creek, and where the South Fork comes in, they built a main canal that took it down to the Bradshaw Drop. You with me so far? Okay. At that point, the canal splits. One split went to Medford, and what doesn't show here is that by this time, Medford has pulled out of the Fish Lake, and they're now getting water from Big Butte Creek and put their line in from there. So they're not part of the picture anymore. But the big solid line canal that goes on the hillsides above East Medford all the way to Phoenix, and then the dotted line, the old Hopkins Canal, he extends beyond Hopkins Orchard, clear out to Scenic Avenue. So he's got a lot of canals built. He's doing a good business. People are signing up to use the water. That's working well. He has a huge investment in it, but he decides to make it bigger. They propose to irrigate virtually the whole valley by extending their canal to Medford onto Talent, and then running it down the west side of the valley along the old stage road until they're irrigating 55,000 acres. Okay. His Roguelands ranch is still demarcated, but he doesn't keep up the canals there anymore. Okay, so this is the proposal. He's going to irrigate the whole place. Well, there were a couple things wrong with it. How much water would that take? And for all his improvements, there's not enough water in 4 Mile and Fish Lakes to irrigate 55,000 acres. So there's a real question about whether there's enough water to do this. And then he doesn't want to put his own cash into this. He says, only when 90% of the landowners along the canal have signed up for water rights will I start the canal. Well, many of those people are irrigating from the natural streams that flow into Bear Creek. They need extra irrigation water, they didn't think, for their irrigating out of Bear Creek. So nowhere near 90% of the people signed up. So this was a great dream, but That's all it was. So you could see this ditch company is slowly not making it. So here's what happens. This is their timeline. Everything's fine. And pretty much what we said, the Fish Lake Ditch Company goes up to 1910. Rogue River Valley Canal Company starts in after that. But in 1922, the irrigators along the Medford ditch that goes to Phoenix are very unhappy with how they're operating the water system. And they want to form their own irrigation district, and they go to court to do that. And they win. So the Medford Irrigation District is formed in 1922 and gets 2/3 of the water that's in this system. Well, that only leaves 1/3 for the Rogue River Valley Canal Company, which now only has the Hopkins Canal because they've given up Roguelands. So that's really enough water for them. But Patrick Welch is not well. He's an old man. And in 1929, he actually passes away. And the people that are running the company for him say, let's get out of here while we can. So the people along the Hopkins Canal form the Rogue River Valley Irrigation District and buy out the rest of the Rogue River Valley Canal Company holdings. Okay. So now at the Bradshaw Drop, 2/3 of the water goes into Medford irrigation canals, and 1/3 of the water goes into the Hopkins Canal, and those are separate irrigation districts. And they stay pretty much the same till now. The one difference is that plan to irrigate the north part of the valley is picked up, and the Talon Irrigation District is formed with water from whole new sources that they're bringing from the east side of the Cascades. And the Talon Irrigation District, which makes these two districts look like peanuts, takes up that whole irrigating the rest of the valley, and in fact supplies some water to these two districts today. So it's all tied together today, but the Talon Irrigation District is the big one. That's the one that really counts. Okay, so Rogue River Valley Canal Company has gone the way of Roguelands and is no more. So does the desert bloom today? Well, it depends on how you define a bloom. In 1941, the U.S. Army was looking for land on which to build a training camp. And here was Rogueland sitting there pretty much unused and cheap. So the Army buys Roguelands out, a whole lot more land out in that area, and to form Camp White. And it was built in 6 months, operated as a training base throughout World War II. As many as 40,000 troops were trained there. There was a prisoner of war camp there. There was a hospital there. It was a big deal. But at the end of the war, declared surplus, and the land is available. So in the 50s, here's what happened. On the upper left, you'll see a housing development was developed around Gibbon Road, just north of Central Point, for low-cost housing for mill and logging people. Glenn Jackson bought a hunk of the land for an industrial park for Medford. That's represented in the picture on the upper right. And White City was developed as the housing area to supply workers for the big industrial park. And on the lower left, sand and gravel mines. Ah, yes, that's what there is in abundance in the Agate Desert, is sand and gravel. There are several that operate in different parts of the former Agate Desert. And in the 1950s, the Denman Wildlife Area was set aside. And I remember that growing up here as they they brought in Chinese pheasants, China pheasants, and that was the best pheasant hunting grounds anywhere. That was for hunters. Okay? That was not a preservation place, which it pretty much is today. That was a hunter's paradise. And the Medford water reclamation plants were put out on the Rogue River at the north part of Roguelands. I love the water reclamation plants that they are. Okay, it's water and sewer plants, what it is. And about 400 acres has been set aside with vernal pools and grasslands that were the way people who had lived here for thousands of years would have remembered this area. In the spring and in the winter and early spring, the vernal pools are everywhere in every low spot. And as they dry, the flowers bloom. And then it becomes, this is a picture from July, it becomes dry land. And we have the Nature Conservancy to thank for preserving much of this, and it's now all under the Southern Oregon Land Conservancy, who continue to care for this land. So, if you ever want to see the desert in bloom the way it once bloomed, in April or May, go out to High Banks Road, and you can see some of the undisturbed, beautiful native vernal pools and grasslands in bloom. That's the end. Special thanks to the Historical Society and the Rogue Valley Irrigation District Archives. Wonderful collections of photographs, maps, and documents.